I've known Jack now for about 4 years, and at that time he was driving around all over the valley, telling his story, an incredible story. And I've talked to him. I went to his place. He lives in Sun City, but now he's unable to drive, so I went over and picked him up, and he is 96-year-old Captain Jack Nemerov.
Thank you, Leo.
And this should be...
Hello, hello?
Yep.
Good. Thank you. I've been going out speaking for 15, 16 years now, and I've addressed students throughout the entire valley, fraternal organizations, congregations, church congregations, and any variety of organizations that call for me, I go out and speak to them. And one of the things I like to do when I am speaking at any group is to answer questions. So if anybody has a question, please ask it anytime. The reason why I say that is that by your asking questions, I can kind of get a feel of what you're trying to find out, what direction you're going, and I can address it as quickly as I possibly can, as best I can. Now, on December 8th, 1941, I did exactly what thousands and thousands of other young guys like myself did from coast to coast. I went down and volunteered. It didn't make me a hero because eventually the draft would have picked me up, but I felt essential to get in there and say something. So I went down and volunteered. And unbeknownst to me, a Bert Baston, who owned a Chevrolet agency, but was also the end coach at the University of Minnesota football team, and I was a student manager on the team for a couple of years, and what he was trying to do was to form an all-Minnesota unit. And if he could form I found out later that if he could form enough in this unit to reach 800 men of volunteers, he would get a direct commission as a lieutenant colonel.
Good Lord.
There were a great number of people that received direct commissions during World War II, all the way up to full colonel, especially in the Ordnance Division, because prior to World War II, there was not too much emphasis placed upon logistics. So they had to build up that end of it as quickly as possible. And the ones that received full colonel commissions were executives in industry. Most of them were pretty decent people. Some, you know, like any other society or any other group, you find a sour apple here and there, but we had a job to do. So as I went in as a private, and my first camp assignment was Camp Sutton, North Carolina, and when we arrived at Camp Sutton, North Carolina, they had nothing for us, no uniforms or anything, and there were no officers around. All we had were a couple of sergeants from the regular army, and they really didn't know what to do with us. Our quarters were nothing more than wooden slats placed on the ground with a tent over it. And those things would hold about 6 of us. So the sergeants, not knowing what to do with us, tried to get us to drill, and we had no uniforms or anything. And then they figured, well, they had a big field out there, so they had us pick up all the little stones and move all the little stones from one side of the field to the other side. Now we had everything piled up, all the stones on the other side. Now they don't know what to do with us again. So they ordered us to pick up those stones on that side and bring them over to this side. On the third week in camp, they finally gave us our combat boots. And we no sooner had them on our feet when they took us out for a little walk of 25 miles. And those boots were as stiff as if they had just come off the back end of a cow. And we had to cover that 25 miles in 6 hours or else. Well, out of the 800 men that started out, there were only half a dozen of us that were stubborn enough to hang in there and get it done. Soon after that, I bumped into Bert Baston, and here he is, resplendent with his beautiful new uniform and his lieutenant colonel identification on his shoulders. And I was coming around one of these little tents, and he was coming around the other way, and I was just filthy, wearing my clothes I wore when I came in, absolutely filthy. And we bumped into each other, and I said, "Oh, hi, Bert." He didn't like that. He's a full colonel in a beautiful new uniform, and I'm a scrubby private without a uniform on. So 2 days later, I was transferred out. I was sent up to Camp Perry, Ohio. At that time, Camp Perry, Ohio was owned by the NRA. And our training up there, if you can call it that, was to fire shells over Lake Erie to test different types of gunpowder. So we did that for a while. Then we finally went out on the firing range where we saw our first weapon. And the weapon that they gave us was the British 03 Enfield. Now the British people arms are a little bit longer than American arms, their legs are a little bit longer. So the stock on that rifle was a little bit too long for us. And if we didn't hold that thing tightly up against our shoulder, that thing had enough recoil to break our shoulder. But we did the best that we could. And then I was transferred to Fort Riley, Kansas, to be part of the cadre to build the 9th Armored Division. And the early tanks that we had, made by Chrysler Corporation, were magnificent pieces of junk. Our tanks required a minimum of 400 horsepower, 400 to 500 horsepower to move them, because those tanks, when fully loaded, weighed 35 tons or more. So we had no engine. Chrysler had no engine powerful enough. The biggest engine that they had was a 60 horsepower 4-cylinder engine. So what they did, they hooked up 7 of those engines in each tank. They called it multivac. And that tank had no turret on top. The firing mechanism was on the right side, and it had very little area in which you could move that pathetic 75 millimeter cannon. So if they had to change direction to fire over here, they had to move the whole tank around. Now, we're trying to get ready, and we had our uniforms, and we were ordered out on maneuvers. And maneuvers were for the sole purpose of finding out if we're combat ready. Now, the plans called for combat infantry to ford that river east of Fort Riley. It was called Funston River. It was wide, but it was fairly shallow. And the combat infantry would cross over in these little rubber boats and establish bridgeheads on the other side, on the east side, and then the combat engineers would come along and build a pontoon bridge, and then the tanks would cross over on that. In the meantime, mechanical equipment on the west side including tanks, were breaking down mechanically. And the combat engineers finally got that bridge, pontoon bridge built. The first two tanks started out, the bridge came apart, the first two tanks sank down into the water. And I was standing on the shore there, on the west side. And by this time I was a corporal, and I said, "This is the most stupid thing I've ever seen in my life." And then I heard this voice behind me say, "Hey, Corporal, what's so stupid about this?" I turned around, here's this poor colonel. I froze. I froze right on the spot. 3 or 4 days later, he called for me, and I went in, and he said, "I want you to know that when I asked a question, I expect an answer. Now, why did you say that was the most stupid thing you've ever seen?" So I'm standing there very rigid, and I said, "Sir, if we look at the training manual, we are being trained to fight exactly the way they fought in World War I. It will not work. Not in this war. The manual states there are 3 echelons of maintenance on these tanks. If a tank breaks down mechanically on the field of fire, echelon 1 has to try to get it going." I said, "Can you imagine having all these guys crawling on these tanks trying to get it going under fire? Everybody's going to get killed." Echelon 2 states if echelon 1 cannot get it going, they call back for a mechanic. So they bring a mechanic up there to get killed. And the colonel said, "Well, what would you do differently?" I said, "Well, sir, I would just abandon the stuff that's under fire. Later on, I would yank it to the rear. There are only 2 components that we have interest in. That's the engines and the drive shaft. I would yank that stuff out of these broken down things, regardless of why they broke down, and rebuild them on assembly lines in the rear as if we're building new units." So the following week, I was off to officer candidate school. And that's a good lesson. If we see something that doesn't look right, think it through and speak up, which is exactly what I did. So that's how I earned my commission. They sent me to Ordnance Officers Candidate School in Baltimore, Maryland, the Aberdeen Proving Ground. And when I finally received my commission, my assignment was to go down to Atlanta and build the first assembly line that the Army had. And I had never done anything like that before in my life. But I got the assembly line going, and started to turn out engines, one engine after the other. So they sent me out to Pomona, California to build a big assembly line because the equipment was getting chewed up by the sand in the California-Arizona maneuver area. And all the pieces of equipment were piling up. So I built a big line in Pomona, California, and I hired about 200 women, plus my 800 GIs, and all these women were magnificent. They could do anything, and they were out to prove it. I had them primarily rebuilding carburetors, distributors, fuel pumps, the small stuff, spark plugs, and their fingers were so nice and nimble that they really went at it, and they did a wonderful job for me. Then I was transferred to Florida, Mississippi to prepare to go overseas. And while I was at Florida, they transferred a major into the outfit who had received a direct commission as a major. And he was a big guy, about 6'4", big, beefy, bony guy. And he wanted to meet all the officers in the outfit on a one-on-one basis. So when it was my turn to go in, he wanted me to know, and he stated very bluntly, that he didn't like 90-day wonders. Here's a guy from civilian life getting a direct commission, And I don't know if you know what a 90-day wonder is. That's what they called us that went through an officer candidate school for 3 months and got a commission. 90-day wonders. So he let me know very clearly he didn't like 90-day wonders. And then he said, and I quote him, "I don't get along well with your people." So I saluted him. I said, "Yes, sir," and I turned around and walked out. And he yelled at me. Anyway, when we got to England, he gave me an awful time. I built that big assembly line in Salisbury Plains. It was 4 parallel lines, 2.5 blocks long. And when I had that going, he put me on detached service with the British Amphibious Forces up at Bedford, England. We were supposed to find out how we can seal off the engines of all the equipment that was just be in the invasion to get through the water up on shore ready for use. We call that the waterproofing process. We finally hit upon a substance like Play-Doh. And what we would do with that would be we would seal all the entrances in the engines that had items attached to it like fuel pumps, carburetor, distributors, and so on, to try to keep the seawater from seeping in. And I finally went back to Salisbury Plains, and this major called me in again, and he said, "Your assembly line isn't any good. We're not getting stuff through." Now, the assembly line was the purpose of assembling equipment that was to be used in the invasion. So he said he put me back in charge so I could read this guy's mind, that he was going to find out and say that I'm incompetent and bust me back through the ranks. But I got back on the line, and I found out in a hurry exactly what was going wrong there, and I fixed it in a big hurry, no problem. Then I started to barrel stuff through Jeeps, 3/4-ton weapons carriers, 6x6s, armored cars, the M8 and M20 armored cars, half-tracks, and the cab that would pull the flat on which that would carry bombs to the planes out in the field. So I was turning them out pretty well. And now we come to the invasion itself. I didn't volunteer for that. But how it came about that I was in there. Now, in our branch of the service, the table of what they had was very flexible, so that if they had a job that had to be done over here, they would look for the guy that's best qualified. They wouldn't assign somebody because he was a first lieutenant or a second lieutenant or a captain. Here's the guy that can get this job done best, no matter what his rank, put him on it. Well, I had a reputation of being able to get things done. And the major decided one day that he's going to come in and make an inspection of the line because I'm getting stuff through, and he can't figure out how, but he wants to come through and find out. And he wasn't going to ride that 2.5 blocks, so he was going to come through in a Jeep. He got about halfway through, and he yelled at me, called for me, and he said, and he stood up in his Jeep. Now you can imagine, he's 6'4", standing in a Jeep. I'm 5'9". I'm standing like this, saluting this guy, and I hate him. I hate his guts. And he said, "I'm getting a lot of heat on me, and we need more units." I said, "Sir, I'll get it. No problem." So he said, "What do you say you and I call a truce?" I said, "Yes, sir. You stay the hell away from me, and I'll stay the hell away from you." Then he said something about he's going to knock my block off. He stepped out of the Jeep. And next thing I knew, I was under arrest for helping him fall down. That wasn't nice of me, what I did to him. He was hauled to the hospital, and I'm under arrest, and they have to have a investigating officer, and part of the investigating officer was a post chaplain who was a friend of mine. And he came in. I had an armed guard in the front of my tent and the back of my tent. Dangerous person. And he came in and he said, "Jack, for goodness sakes, everybody knew what was going on. All you had to do is come up to headquarters and file a complaint." I said, "Well, this is very personal, and I had to take care of myself." He said, "You certainly did. He's in bad shape." I said, "Too bad, too bad." Oh, he said, "The general doesn't want to hold a court-martial. They don't want this to get out." I just shrugged my shoulders, and he said, "We're going to work out a deal, and we'll come back and we'll tell you what it is." So he came back a few days later. He said, "We're putting you down at the bottom of the promotion list." I said, "That's okay with me. When this is over, I'm out of here." And he said, "Oh, good, good." He said, "And you just volunteered for the invasion." That's how I got in on it. They figured, well, I'd get knocked off and that'd be the end of the story, but I fooled them. Anyway, we were getting ready for the invasion itself, and starting about the 1st of March, they started to pull troops down from Scotland and northern England down to southern England. And by the time we were all assembled in southern England, we had pretty close to 2 million men down there. All of them, American, British, Free French,
Canadian,
some Polish troops. We were stretched out from Bournemouth all the way over here to Exeter, which is about 60, 65 miles, all crammed in there with men, material, and 2 days before we were going to go in, we were supposed to go in on the 5th, and that was canceled because of a storm moving into the area. So 2 days before the 5th, chaplains came down to conduct services for any of us that wanted it. However, if the chaplain was here, not of your faith, and you were here, and a chaplain of your faith was over here, you couldn't get to him. With all the men and equipment, impossible. So what we did, we gathered around the chaplain of whatever faith, and we didn't gather around the chaplain to pray. There's no way that we can pray, "Hey, God, make sure there's no bullet with my name on it." If it happens, it happens. So what we were doing, actually, was reaffirming our faith. That was all that we were doing. The chaplain that I was addressing here was Catholic. So it must have worked. We started out, about 65% of those going in for the invasion went across on the larger craft that would hold about 200 to 250 personnel, and the rest of us went across on these little landing craft. Those landing craft would hold anywhere from 25 to 30 some personnel. And it was decided to go in on the 6th because if they had to cancel that date, all the elements that would be essential to the invasion would not be lined up properly again until sometime in July. So Eisenhower decided we're going to go on the 6th. There's supposed to be a little hole in the storm. So off we went. About every 15, 20 minutes, our craft would stop in the water and start to circle. And the reason why they were doing that, they were forming lines of invasion with other craft. Now, the reason why they had to do that was because we were going to invade 5 beaches. Utah and Omaha assigned to the Americans, Sword, Juno, and Gold over here assigned to the British, Canadians, and some Free French and some Polish troops. Excuse me. So they were forming these lines. Now, with 150,000 personnel in these crafts going in, and the western side of Utah Beach all the way over here to the eastern side of Gold Beach was approximately 45 miles. That whole area was going to be invaded. Now, we knew going in that Omaha Beach was most heavily fortified, because for months and months in advance, British frogmen and U.S. Navy personnel would probe the whole French coast for 200 miles every night, and to bring information back to us so that we would have a pretty good idea of what we're going to be confronted with. They would even in the night sneak up on shore to get an idea of what's in there. We also had good information from the Free French, who gives information as to where the reserve units of the Wehrmacht and the Panzer Division were located, maybe 15 miles back of the beaches. So we had pretty good information. Another piece of information that we had was the fact that in front of Omaha Beach, the seabed was very, very rough. You know, from years and years of tide and storms and so on. It was very rough. And we also knew the closest location of the crack Wehrmacht back there and the Panzer divisions, about 50 miles back. We also had information on these pillboxes that were built in the hills above Omaha Beach. A pillbox is nothing more or less than a cement and steel structure about the size of your classroom. That's about all it was. And we had nothing in our arsenal in those years that could take them out. You know, not like you see these smart bombs today. We had nothing. Not even the big 16-inch guns. That would leave approximately 35,000 combat people coming in on Omaha Beach. Now, Omaha Beach itself is 4 miles wide, but the landing area, the fighting area, is comparatively small. You cannot land 35,000 troops at one time, period. So they were broken down into 4 waves of boats coming in. There was a 5th wave of craft coming in, but that was a supply line craft loaded with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and so on. Now, each one of us had to go in carrying a minimum of 3 days' supply of ammunition in our pack and 3 days' supply of food. So the packs that we had on our back weighed easily 35, 40 pounds. And we could cram in whatever else we wanted. And it was belted pretty tight against our bodies, because if it wasn't, the pack would rub our skin off our back. Now, the craft I was on was designated for the 2nd row. I went in with the headquarters company of the 29th Infantry Division. And many of the pilots of the landing craft panicked because of the heavy fire. And they were moving their craft around in the water. Some of them turned their craft at a parallel angle to the shoreline itself, and the English Channel is always choppy and wavy. And some of those that turned their craft that way were swamped by the waves. They sank, and the guys on there drowned. In the first 15 minutes, we had 5,000 casualties. A lot of them drowned. Some going in would catch their foot on something on the seabed. He would drop in the water, couldn't get his feet up, couldn't get back up, and I was yelling at my guys, and I could hear others yelling the same thing. Keep going. We know that if we stop in the water, we're going to get hit. I've got to get my men up on shore. And other officers up there knew the same thing. They had to keep going. And once we hit the shore, exhausted, we couldn't let our men lie down on the sand and catch their breath because we're too exposed. So we had to keep them moving another 115, 120 yards inland until we got to the base of the hills to get some protection. It wasn't a pleasant sight to see guys going down. The Germans were trained to obey. We were trained to think. And that was the best weapon that we gave our young men. Think. Now, the German gunners up in the pillboxes were told to fire a certain way, certain direction, period. And that's what they did. They never changed. Now, some of the landing craft coming in over here, for example, had machine guns zeroed in on them. And the officers on those craft could tell because every 6th round was a tracer, red hot tracer. And one craft, well, I'll tell you, if I would have been on that craft, when they lowered the ramp on that particular craft, with the machine gun bullets coming in on them, the captain and lieutenant ran down the ramp, and they were so full of bullets before they hit the water that they really sank in a hurry. The guys behind them did the same thing. They ran down the ramp. 19 of them were machine gunned right off the bat from that particular craft. That is written up in a story called The Bedford Boys. There's a book on that. Maybe some of you have run across it. So, if I would have been on that craft, knowing that the machine gun fire is coming in, I would have told the guys to go over the side. Don't go down that ramp. Where we came in over here, and incidentally, the craft I was on, he got so mixed up with the line that we ended up in the first row. So those of us in our craft probably were some of the first on Omaha Beach. But the machine gun fire over here wasn't as heavy as over here. It's very sporadic. And then we could see how their pattern of fire was from the pillboxes, where this pillbox over here was supporting the fire of the pillbox over here. So when they cross-fired, they formed a seam in there where there was no firing, it was open. So we timed ourselves with those seams so we could come through without getting hit. Now, the first couple of hours on Omaha Beach was tough. General Bradley issued orders not to try to land any more equipment because everything that was trying to get off the craft, the tanks and so on, they were trying to get off the craft, hit the water, and conked out. That waterproofing process was a failure. So he didn't know at that time if we could hold the beach. So he didn't want, if he had to pull us off, he didn't want to leave any American equipment there for the Germans to have. So after 2 hours, he ordered no more equipment landing. We persevered, and the only way that we could take out these pillboxes was to get up very close with flamethrowers and hand grenades. And that was tough. Now, after about 5 hours of fighting, we solidified the beach, and we held in there. And more troops were starting to come across. So we were getting some help. Now, after 6 hours, the troops from Omaha Beach started to penetrate inland. And we did, as I mentioned before, we knew about the Wehrmacht divisions and the Panzers. and we were wondering, where are they? Well, those units were under the direct command of Adolf Hitler. He never got up before 10:30 in the morning, and no one would dare disturb him. So we hit the beach at 6:30, and they're sitting back here. The first units that moved toward the beach was the Panzer Division. They started moving about 12:30, and their tanks were too heavy to go through the soft farm field, so they hit the road toward the beach itself. And thank goodness our P-47 pilots coming over from England cut them to absolute junk. Not a single one of those tanks ever came close to us. Now our units were hooking up with the 101st, about 6 or 7 miles inland, and the 101st incidentally had various assignments that they had to take care of. Number one, they had to protect certain bridges back there so that the Germans wouldn't destroy them. And there were a lot of little rivers and streams back in there. And the reason why they had to protect those bridges so that when our troops could penetrate and bring in tanks, they would have something to cross the little streams and rivers with, instead of trying to build something for them to cross. Now, the British troops on Sword had an assignment to penetrate 7 miles inland and capture the Caen airfield. The American troops had orders over here to head for Saint-Mère-Église. And Saint-Mère-Église was important because from there, part of our forces could branch off to the peninsula, Cherbourg Peninsula, and we needed that Cherbourg Peninsula because that was the only deep sea port in all of that area there. And we needed badly a deep sea port. So they had a fight to get to that deep sea port at Cherbourg. And the German commander there received orders. He couldn't surrender, he couldn't retreat. So what he did, he took all kinds of junk that he had, tanks, trucks, everything that he had, and dumped them in the water, in the deep water, to deny us the use of the port. So before we could use that port, they had to get salvage in there to get that stuff out of there. The other part from Saint-Mère-Église would head south toward Saint-Lô. Well, everything was planned out. The only problem we had was that the British forces did not take Caen on schedule, that airfield. They took it later, but what we wanted that airfield for was for the P-47 and P-38, P-51 pilots to come over from England and use that airfield so that they could accompany the bombers coming over from England deeper into Germany. Now, I addressed one day the Capt organization, the Civil Air Patrol, and one of the gentlemen sitting there put up his hand and asked a question. He said, "You know, I was a P-47 pilot on Caen." And he said, "How did you get the fuel over there? It's impossible to take these 64-gallon drums and put them on landing craft, unload them over there so they could have fuel." I said, "Well, what we did, we laid a pipeline across." And he said, "A pipeline? That fast?" He said, "It's impossible." I said, "No, it wasn't. We used glorified fire hose." We had fire hoses going from England across to where that town airfield was, with pumps. We were pumping fuel through it. Now, we reached Paris on August 25th. That beautiful parade that you see sometimes on television didn't take place until August 26th, because Eisenhower wanted the American troops to have time to shave, clean up their uniforms so they could march down that Étoile looked pretty spiffy. Now, our unit was in the very rear end on the 26th, and our assignment was to break off and take over the entire French automotive industry, which we did. So, I was assigned to activate the little feeder plants for the automotive industry. Their system was different than ours. I could walk into a place, the room would be smaller than this, and the owner would live in the back or upstairs, and he could have a couple of grinding machines on the floor, and I could figure out that he could grind X number of rings to specifications in 30 days for, let's say, our tank engines, and I would give him a 90-day supply, sign a voucher, and he would take it up to military government and get paid. I never had a negotiated price. I activated about 350 of these little plants. I mean, they were small. And I was manufacturing all kinds of parts for the engines themselves. And then I received an assignment to get down to Munich to take over the BMW plant because we were going to rebuild our tanks there. Now, when I arrived at the BMW plant, I had to make sure that the Germans weren't going to smash it up because we wanted to use it. So that's the reason why they sent me down there. Now, when I was inspecting that plant, I heard a voice behind me in perfect English say, "Oh, too bad, too bad." And I turned around, you know, just like any of us would say, "What are you talking about? What's too bad?" He said, "Oh, we didn't know." And when he said that, I pulled my .45 out and he jumped. He identified himself as the foreman of the plant. So I knew I better not shoot him because I would need him. So he didn't know. Nobody in that area knew. No one. I asked a lot of those people, the Germans there. No one knew about Dachau, which is only exactly 10 miles away from the BMW plant. So it's been going through my mind ever since about they didn't know. Here's a country of Germans, very intelligent people, well-educated people. Many of the inner circle around Adolf Hitler had doctorate degrees. How could people like that have done what they did? Educated people. How could they? But they did it. I still haven't been able to come up with an answer for that. Anyway, I commandeered a few 6x6s and picked up some people from there and also people from BMW to take them out to Dachau, which is only 10 miles away. Now, there's a lot of confusion in the writings up of uncovering of these camps. I've had people come call me and tell me, "Oh, I was a liberator here, I was a liberator there." That's a lot of bunk. No one person can come up and say that they liberated any camp. The reason for that was, at that time of the war, Eisenhower had issued very firm orders. You stop for nothing. Nothing. You keep fighting until they quit. Second reason, many of the commanders, battalion-sized commanders, were pretty intelligent guys, and they knew they couldn't go into a camp to spook these people. They had to stop, pass by, and send for interpreters to talk to these people. I took a chance because I could speak to them. And I walked in to the camp in Dachau. What a horrible sight that was. Bodies all over the ground. The commandant of each camp had to account for each one of the registered prisoners in his camp. Registered. There's a big difference. Because towards the end there, the Germans were taking Russian troops that they captured into these camps. They weren't registered. They get them into these camps, kill them, and burn them up. So we really have no accurate count as to the number of people that were killed in these camps. As far as the registered prisoners are concerned, we do have a fairly accurate count. There were 6 million Jews killed in camps. There were 6 million or more, maybe 10 million Christians killed in these camps. There were 2,000 priests killed in these camps, all recorded. Anyway, the commandant, as I said, had to account for all those that were in his books, recorded prisoners. So what they would do each morning, they would have a roll call out in the parade grounds. Those prisoners that happened to live through the night had to carry the ones that did not live through the night out and lay them on the ground so they could be accounted for. So here we have these bodies. And some of those bodies must have been laying out there for a few days because they were decomposing. And the others, those that had enough strength to get up on their feet, seemed to have the compulsion that if they would keep walking, they would stay alive. Well, here they are, but I came in, walking around, the bodies on the ground, gave us a kind of a strange look, which I understood later, because the Germans had developed killing squads. One killing squad wore black uniforms, another wore gray-green uniforms, another wore brown uniforms. They would come into the camps, shoot some of the prisoners, and leave. We came in wearing khaki uniforms. So as far as they were concerned, we're the final killing squad to finish them off. So those few that kept moving, walking around, I wanted to talk to them, so I held up my arms like this to stop them so I could speak to them. And I spoke to them in Jewish, that we are Americans, that we're there to help them, not kill them. And when they heard that, I had about 7 of my fine young men with me. They gathered around us, formed a circle around us, and they reached out to touch the fabric of our uniforms. When they felt the fabric was real, they grabbed us by our arms, as weak as they were, and just held on. And they cried. I mean, they started to cry. And I admit we cried with them. It was such a pitiful situation. It was just terrible. We Americans, by this time, were the best fighters in the world. Absolute best. We were tough. But we're still Americans. We're not mean. My guys reach into their packs to take the food out to give to these walking scarecrows. And what a mistake that was. 2 of those prisoners reached into one of the cans, took the food out, gulped it down, and dropped dead right in front of us. And oh, we're here to help them, to save them. We just killed 2 of them. One of my guys went absolutely wild when that occurred, and there were still some German guards in the back of the camp. Why they remained there, I don't know, but they were there. So my guy went after the German guards with his rifle. He didn't shoot at him, but he was hitting him with the butt of his rifle, and he had a couple of them down on the ground, and I knew I had to stop it, because if some brass would have walked in and witnessed that, this poor guy of mine could have gotten as much as 5 years in prison. So I ordered the rest of the guys to disarm him and push him out the camp. So instead of handing his weapon to his buddies, he handed it to one of these scarecrows. And this guy tried to finish off the 2 guys on the ground, but he was too weak to do any damage. I walked back in the camp, and off here to the left there was a bunch of scrubby trees and bushes, and there was a ravine in there with a wooden platform over it. I walked across that, and right on the other side there was a big shed. It had a rusty lock on it. I broke the lock and got inside the shed, and the shed was full of bags of lime and tools and all kinds of stuff. And right to the right, about 25 or 30 feet to the right, was a crematorium. So I took these people that didn't know, and I had them dig a ditch in front of the crematorium and pick up some of these bodies that were decomposing and put them in that ditch and cover them. There's nothing else that we could do. We couldn't identify them. We had to get them buried. So that was my experience. And I'll tell you, I have 4 sons. I couldn't talk about this for 50, 60 years. And one day out here, I received a call from a teacher in the Peoria school system and asked me if I knew of anybody that could come and talk to her class about World War II, and I figured, well, I'll take a chance. And that was in January of 1999, excuse me. And I went there and I stumbled and fumbled. It was difficult, extremely difficult. And that's how I got started. I have covered well over 100,000 students, various clubs, congregations. Wherever they want me, I'll go. When I finish in the classroom, I thank the young people there, because they are doing as much for me as I'm doing for them. They are giving me therapy. I try to explain that to some veterans that can't speak. Come with me. It'll do you a lot of good. That therapy of talking to young people, I mean, nothing can replace it, believe me. Young people are very aware of what things they want to learn about, and they dig into it. After the Nuremberg trials, they had trials in other places of some of the that were very, very guilty, and one of the places they had trials was in Dachau. And they had 36 of them were sentenced to be hung. 4 or 5 had their sentences changed to life imprisonment. The others were hung. The gallows were built right in Dachau, and they were hung there. So there's a lot of stories about World War II that really aren't published very much. There are a lot of stories that are over-published, over-frilled. I've run across so many things that are so wrong. And as a matter of fact, I pulled up a story about Dachau that was written by the commanding general of the 45th Infantry Division. And he always had newspapermen travel with his group. And he wrote a story about how he liberated Dachau, and the prisoners there started to riot. He said 30,000 prisoners rioted, and in order to quiet them down, he had his men fired over their heads. And that story appeared in the History Channel. So, being me, I wrote a little note to the History Channel, and I said, first of all, if any commanding general had done that, Eisenhower would have strung him up by his thumbs, because his orders were very explicit. You do not stop, you keep fighting. Secondly, I would like to have this commanding general explain to me how 30,000 prisoners, most of whom couldn't even get up on their feet, they were so weak, could riot. That story was pulled. History Channel notified me they pulled it. Anyway,
Thank you, Clem. You have one question back here, Jack.
Have you ever gone back to Normandy for the D-Day celebration, or have you?
I was signed up to go back for the 70th anniversary this past June 6th. And they had my name, and they were going to publicize all those that were coming back that had participated. And then I received a call. My youngest son contacted my doctor, and my doctor told him that if I take that flight, 13-hour night flight, I would be subject to blood clots in my legs. So my son called me and said, "Dad, you're not going, period." And then my other sons called me and said, "You're not going, period." So my son up in Chicago found out there was going to be services in Bedford, Virginia. Where
We have several of them.
Thanks again.
Thank you. And I thank all of you.
Couple quick things.